everyone, to the Power Apps partner Airlift Online. Thanks for joining us. We have a great lineup of sessions for you during this week on Airlift, but let's have a few housekeeping announcements first. If you happen to face any audio or video issues during the session or have any technical questions, please post your queries in the Q&A panel and our team is here to help you. We often get many questions during a session and we'll do our best to respond to them in real time. Please note that this session will also be recorded, and the recording will be available for on-demand viewing approximately 48 hours after today's broadcast. In this online Airlift event, we'll be taking a deep dive into Microsoft Power Apps this week, and this will be followed up by another Power Automate Airlift event soon after. Today, we'll be working with model-driven apps and exploring automation options. Our presenters today will be Chris Huntingford, the technical architect in the One Commercial Partner team at Microsoft, and accompanying him will be Nelson Lopez. Nelson is the National Partner Technology Architect at Microsoft Canada and is focused in the area of Power Platform and low-code, no-code technologies. He's been with Microsoft for 19 years and has held various technology and industry specialist roles. Without any further ado, I'll now hand over the session to our presenters. Let's welcome Chris first. Chris, the floor is all yours.
Hi everyone, my name is Chris Huntingford and I'm a Partner Technical Architect here at Microsoft. Today, as part of the Power Apps Virtual Airlift, I get to talk to you about model-driven applications. So what are we going to cover? Well, first of all, we'll take a review of what exactly model-driven apps are. I mean, a lot of you know how to build Canvas apps, some of you know model apps, some of you know portals. I mean, there's loads of different types of apps, and we're going to drill into the model apps piece. The next part we're going to be talking about is how to organize your model-driven app with components. So how to create those components and ready yourself to build out that awesome model-driven application. And then finally, we'll be taking a look at considerations for the best user experience from a model-driven app perspective. So without any further ado, let's get started. What exactly is a model-driven app? Well, if I break it down, as I said before, some of you know Canvas apps, some of you know how to build custom apps. A model-driven application is effectively forms and lists over data. Now, it's a whole lot more than that. I'm simplifying it greatly, and we'll dig into the other various areas around why it's more than that. But what it does is it's supposed to provide a consistent user experience across all applications and devices. So we imagine this UX or user experience that if I log into my tablet or I log into my mobile device, my mobile phone, or log into my laptop, I have the same experience. I'm experiencing the same thing from a process perspective, which is really great, and it provides continuity and user adoption. And then finally, building easy to build with a configuration first approach. So I always equate this to Lego, right? We've provided you with a ton of Lego bricks, a ton of pre-built bricks that you can use to make your own solution, which is really cool. So you can choose to follow the instructions and build something out that, looks a little bit like Dynamics, or you can go absolutely crazy and build something completely different. And I always like to say you have to use your imagination, but it is configuration first. Okay, so let's dig into the various areas of this. Now, if I take a look at where a model-driven app lives within the sort of Power Platform space or business application space, and by the way, this is just my version of the slide, right? You can see that they all live on top of the Common Data Service. Now, the CDS is what drives, Common Data Service is what drives a model-driven application. So you need to have a great data model in order to make sure your model-driven app works really well. So let me give you an example of why a model app is so important. I'm going to create a real-world example. So let's take Mary, and Mary has a complaint that she would like to log. So she calls into the contact center, and Jeff picks up the phone, and he's like, "Hey, how's it going?" Mary says, "Look, I'd love to log a complaint." And Jeff says, "No problem. I'm going to open up my SQL database and I'm going to, quickly log in and I'm going to open table AB4_complaints and I'm going to capture your complaints in there." That doesn't happen, right? You need to have a user experience on top of that data layer. And that's effectively where your model-driven app comes in. It's a process-driven user experience to provide the user with the ability to capture data and create information in a more governed format, right? So typically the way that I like to frame it is that you don't want to give people direct access to the data source. You want to have a business logic layer or application layer on top of it to provide that. And that's where model-driven apps are great. It's about that process-driven user experience. So now, if you compare model-driven apps to Dynamics, well, what used to be called Dynamics 365 customer engagement. But if you look at Dynamics 365 for marketing, for sales, for service, for field service, and unified resource scheduling, effectively, those are just model-driven applications that have got pre-built functionality for you. So if you're looking at, building a model-driven app out to manage pipeline, well, you don't need to do that because Dynamics 365 has got that for you already. If you wanted to build out a whole marketing suite, well, you don't need to do that. We've built that already here at Microsoft. But what about something like facilities management? We don't really have a model-driven app for that. So, we're hoping you guys will create one using the model-driven app and common data service functionality. So what's really special? What's built into all these model-driven apps? Well, there's a ton of really great functionality that's pre-built into model-driven apps. So as I said before, within the common data service, it provides you with a rich data layer and a rich services layer, but then surfaces a lot of this functionality within model-driven apps. So I'm not going to go ahead and explain every single one of these because we will be here all day and I can talk for England. So let's take a look at things like Advanced Find. You have this amazing visual query tool directly embedded within model-driven apps to look for data. You're saying, wow, that's pretty normal. Well, no, it's because you're looking at all these cross entities and you're looking at the relationships that have been built between entities, and you can find data related to other pieces of information. So when you're generating your reports and views, that creates an amazing mechanism to understand exactly what data is within your org. Well, what about things like personal views and dashboards? Did you know that in the model-driven application framework, if you have the right security roles and permissions, you can generate your own views and you can actually share those with your peers. So as an example, if I've got a list of contacts and my system admin hasn't supplied me with a view to give me a list of all the contacts that live in a certain area, I can go ahead and I can create that view. Now that really helps me because when I do that, I can actually get access to data or information that I need to make sure that I can do my job better. Things like Excel integration. Now, you know what? You're going, wow, Chris, you're trying to get us away from Excel. Well, not all the time, because some people really like to work in Excel, and we're trying to make sure that we give people the best opportunity to work in the tools that they understand. But the great thing is that their data is still secured at rest. We have the ability to do client dev extensibility. So for those of you that are pro coders out there that love to write code, no problem whatsoever. I made the comparison to Lego before. We give you the opportunity to build out your own Lego bricks. So if you find a piece of functionality or you need a piece of functionality and there's nothing in the tool that fits that, go right ahead and build it yourself. Just follow the best practices. We've got this amazing functionality that leverages tools within Power Automate. So we've got business process control. We can embed business processes against forms and various entities that cross and span different relationships. So as an example, I can take an asset through an asset lifecycle management process. But if I've got other things that are associated to that asset, like inspections, I can then include it in that business process. Some of the other great tools that we've got in here are timeline activities. So we've embedded this timeline activity viewer directly in specific entities. So a good example of that would be contacts. And I can see all the collaboration and communication I've had with a contact across a timeline. And I can even filter it, and we'll explore that a little bit later. We've got all sorts of other fantastic things like the ability to duplicate detect data and make sure data is correct to a certain extent. One of the biggest key things around this is around the ability to have multiple makers. So as somebody that's building an app, a model-driven app, I can have more than one maker. A Canvas app is typically limited to one maker unless you're copy-pasting functionality between apps, whereas model-driven app makers can all work on the same apps. And then another great piece of functionality is recently viewed or pinned. So again, making information relevant to you that you've recently accessed. So as an example, that previous example I gave with Mary and Jeff, maybe Jeff works with Mary quite a lot. I could have Mary's contact pinned, and I could access her information as and when I needed, again, provided I have the right security roles and permissions. So all this rich functionality has been pre-included within model-driven apps. You don't need to reinvent it within the Canvas app framework. So we look at a thing called application components. So when we build apps, we have these tools or bricks that we use to create our apps. So I'm going to go through these very briefly and we'll do a little demo. So the first example is what we call site navigation. So some of you have been onto websites and it says explore this site. Well, that's awesome. So you can do the exact same thing here. You can go ahead and explore that website. You can explore this system, and you can understand the kind of map. So you can build out your own site navigation within the model-driven application. We have dashboards. Dashboards are a consolidation of both lists and visual representations of data. Now, this is not Power BI, right? This is effectively dashboards embedded within model-driven apps. You can interact with that information. You can drill in and really gain insight into what's going on in your organization. As I mentioned before, business process flows, these come from Power Automate. We can embed business process flows against lists of records or specific records and take that information through a process to make sure the right governance and compliance is applied to it, but also it guides the user and helps them capture the right information. So if you've got somebody brand spanking new into your contact center, you can actually help them through that process without doing very much work. We have this concept of forms. Forms are a great mechanism to get data from people. So forms provide the ability for you to capture information or view singular pieces of information about a specific person or record or entity. So as an example, I could have a contact record and I could go ahead and see all of the complaints that have been logged against that contact. I could also see all the assets against the building. I could see all of the facilities against the building. Then you have views. Views are effectively a list of those records. So I might have a list of contacts or a list of accounts or a list of facilities. And then finally charts. Charts kind of blend into dashboards. Again, they're the more visual representation of what you see from a view. So as an example, I might have a list of contacts, but I might want to view that list of contacts in a pie chart. And that might separate the list by area or contact type. And it's a really great way to get information about a specific list of records. So when we're talking about building model-driven applications, we talk about from zero to model-driven app. Now, it's not the same way you build a Canvas app. Typically with the Canvas apps, you start from the canvas and you create your bits and pieces that work within the canvas. Model-driven apps work a bit different. They're very much reliant on the data model. Now, I'm going to give you a heads up here. A bad data model will equal an even worse model-driven app. So you do need to plan your data model correctly. We then have forms and views. So create the forms and views that you need within the data model, which is really cool. So if I want to create a form to capture contacts, I can quite easily do that. You're building in your automation layer with business rules and business process flows. And then finally, you composing your app. So if you take a look at this from a visual perspective, building out your data model, creating the forms and views you need to view and interact with that data, generating your automation layer to make sure that people don't have to capture everything or the data that's really needed is surfaced to them in the right way. And then finally, you're generating your model-driven app. And we'll actually create one later on in this presentation. So what I thought I would do is go into a quick demonstration and show you what a model-driven app actually looks like. So let's dive into our Maker experience over here. So as you can see, I'm in make.powerapps.com. And this is my list of model-driven applications that I've got in my environment. You can see that they've been tagged as model-driven apps. Okay. Now, all I need to do to access this model-driven app is simply click it over there. This will open it up in my browser. I'll have my model-driven app UI surfaced in front of me. Great. So there we go. Now, you'll see that most model-driven apps look quite similar. So you'll have the same sort of navigation on the left, the same type of navigation at the top with very similar pieces of very similar functionality in the ribbon. So I mentioned the ability to export to Excel. Effectively, what I'm looking at now is a view of active products. So this is my list of active products. If I drill down, I can change the views. So I can see all the inactive products. I have the ability to sort by the various categories over here. And what I can even do is I can even apply filters, if I'd really like to this data, to get a really great list. I mentioned that find or advanced find functionality that's available on the top right. So this gives you a really great UI to search for information. So I've got this ability to create these visual queries and actually interact with data and create lists that really help me understand what's going on in my organization. You've also got other search functionality, which we won't drill into now. So this is a very basic example of the UI on a model-driven app. Once I'm back at my list of records, I can actually click into a certain record and interact with that information directly through one of the forms. Forms are a great way of getting information as well as displaying information to users. This is one example of a model-driven app. What I thought I would do is show you another example. So something I built. So this is an example of a model-driven application to help me manage adventure golf rounds. So at one point in my career, we went to go and play adventure golf or junkyard golf. And it's like this little fun indoor golf course. And all I decided to do was, instead of filling out the cards, I created a Canvas app to help me track the scores, and then a model-driven application to help me manage the scores. So as you can see, here's my model-driven app. You can actually see the person with the lowest score. This was part of a demo. The person with the lowest score, there we go, would have been the winner. I can also track the number of rounds played, as well as the actual scores by round. Now, that's really cool, right? It was really simple for me to capture the information. I had a list of contacts in my system, and each of my contacts was assigned to a team. So all we did was we managed different teams. My dashboards were quite key in the management of this application. We had what we call our Junkyard Golf reporting app. And what it let me do is let me actually show you a more visual representation in a much cooler way of what was going on. So now, one of my colleagues will be going into a more in-depth demonstration of embedding applications, but I've embedded Power BI as well as a Canvas app in my model-driven application to give you a better experience. So model-driven applications are really great from a management perspective and help you manage that process around data, but they're also really great for embedding other solutions in. So if I drill back to my presentation and I summarize very quickly from a model-driven app perspective, number one, remember that it can just be presumed as forms over data, but it's a whole lot more than that. You've got a lot more functionality and pre-built pieces out the box to use. Number two, it is reliant on the data model. And number three, it acts as a great way for you to manage data through a process. Great. So next, we'll be moving on to organizing with model-driven app components. All right. So what does organizing with model-driven app components actually mean? Well, first of all, it allows you to build task-based applications. I'm going to pause there and just explain something very important here. Previously, when we used to build out solutions, so I used to be a developer and I used to work for Borland. And when I created solutions, I used to hammer in loads of functionality into a single line of business application. Now what you're doing is you're focusing on building out these smaller micro applications that enable users to fulfill certain sets of tasks. So it's really promoting user adoption. You're defining a subset of the overall solution assets to make up an application. So you can reuse stuff within model-driven apps. So as an example, if I'm going to use the contact entity within 5 or 6 of my applications, that's fine because the contact entity exists within the platform. So I only need to create it once, but I can reuse it over and over again. Same with the subcomponents like charts and dashboards. I only need to build once, but use many. And then it really enables focusing the user only on the assets they need to perform those specific tasks. So let me give you an example here. It's very easy for me to create a complaints management system and then include loads of other pieces of functionality that might be irrelevant. But if I've got somebody just dealing in complaints, why give them that extra functionality? It doesn't make sense. So only give them access to the information that they need. So if I flick out to the next slide, I want to talk about this unified experience or unified interface. Previously in other versions of this, we might have had different interfaces that users would access via mobile or via Outlook. But one of the things we decided and we understood was that a consistent responsive experience was needed. Okay. We needed to have the equivalent functionality across all surfaces, whether it was web or mobile or Outlook. And that was really important for us because it promoted user adoption once again. It gave people a familiar environment when leveraging the solutions. It was very focused on this modular experience as well. So again, we decided to make sure that these solutions were scenario focused and very easy to build and share across the framework. So one platform, many applications or micro applications. Another thing we picked up was that instead of having forms with fields on them, that's great. You can have as many forms and fields as you would like. I always say form with 100 fields that does 100 things can be quite complicated. But what about creating these rich visualizations in which you could interact with data in a different way? So a form with 10 fields that does 100 things is way more important and way more focused, and it gives the user a better experience. These forms and these applications are highly performant. There's efficient metadata synchronization for better performance and continued investments to improve the speed in which client experiences take place. So What we want to make sure is that we're giving people such a performance experience that when they walk away, especially from a user perspective, it is more easily adopted. People want to use this. One of the important things I think we also take quite a big focus on is accessibility. So the model-driven apps are built with accessibility in mind. It is very difficult to retrofit accessible functionality later on. Accessibility effectively is a mismatched interaction between a person and their environment. Now, think about somebody that has eyesight that isn't exactly the same as yours, right? They may not be able to see as well as you can. Well, we need to make sure that our solutions are accessible. The accessible, addressable market is absolutely massive. There are loads of people out there with idiosyncrasies that need to be catered for. And then finally, we want to really make sure that our enhanced experiences are taken care of. So we want to give people the ability to have access to data and information directly through these amazing dashboards and user interfaces. So instead of flat data in a view or just a form, we have these interactive experiences where people can really go and understand information within their organization and get a true reflection of what's going on. So a couple of things that we've done to make sure that this takes place. One of the things that's become quite relevant, especially with engaging with customers within the scenario of a model-driven application, are what we call the timeline commands. So you can have timelines embedded directly against a set of records or a record and actually watch and communicate with that specific record. Now, I purposely said record, not contact, because I can have a sales opportunity with a timeline directly embedded in it, and that's not a contact. Or I can have an asset with a timeline of interactions that's taken place against that asset. When you look at the contact, as an example, I can view all of the emails, phone calls, tasks, appointments that have been created against that contact record. What's even cooler is that integrates directly with Outlook or Exchange if you needed to. We've also got this concept of the navigate away experience. So now you create a certain form and you add in a certain piece of information and you haven't saved that form. And then you try and navigate away. It actually warns you if you have or haven't saved that data. So we make sure that you guys really understand that your data is important to us. And the navigate away experience just promotes a better user experience within the model-driven application. This one is a really key thing because when you think about a model-driven application and you have a certain field validation rules. So as an example, you have a field that requires an email address. That email address is not filled in correctly. When you try and save that form, in order to make sure that data is respected and it's filled in correctly, we warn you that something hasn't been put in correctly. So we actually flag it up. And what you can do is you can click on that specific line item and actually navigate directly to the record and fill that information in correctly. So think about field validation rules that are made relevant to users in a more user-friendly way. It's very important that we respect the data because the people that are generating the reports need to make sure that their information is accurate. Finally, things like recently used. So if I'm going to create a record and do a lookup to another record, all I'm going to do is I'm going to pick the most recently used records. So if I take primary contact against an asset, I can actually see the most recently used records that I've accessed from a contact perspective. It's also very important that we have this concept of multiple records or set regarding. So I can have an activity in my system like an email, and I can set that regarding to things like accounts and contacts and assets if I really need to. And that's essentially setting regarding to various record types. We also have made some improvements to the way that records and information are viewed within the model-driven application. So we've created a thing called header density. And what that basically means is that we've got the ability to bring information together and create less white space within the actual form itself. This also promotes a much better user experience. Finally, we have the concept of adding things like relational pieces of information to a form. Now, this is one of the most important things you'll learn when interacting with records. The concept of relationships was explained earlier in one of the courses. Now, when I'm viewing information on a record, as an example, I have an asset record, okay, or an account record at least, and I want to see all the related contacts to that record. I can add a thing called a subgrid, and that subgrid shows up those records in a list. This is one of the most important components that you'll be adding to forms because it makes the user experience flow in a much more natural way. It's really important that users have access to see that information very quickly. So when a user needs to access data, instead of having to hop around the system and click on loads of things, that information is readily available to them directly within a subgrid. What's also great, though, is that when you're capturing records from a relational perspective into that subgrid, it respects the natural flow of the record. So it understands that you've captured that specific record from the parent record. So it'll fill in that relational information, and you can make subgrids editable. So what's cool about that is that if you have a list of things against a record and you need to edit them in an Excel-like fashion, you can quite quickly do that using a subgrid. Now, what is the real difference between subgrid and related entities? So if I flick back to the slide at the top, a subgrid is typically embedded directly in the form, whereas a related record is accessed directly through the tabs at the very top. So when you're looking at the difference between the two, as you can see, I've got a list here of how it all fits together. Subgrids are displayed directly against the parent form. They can be filtered to control presented data, so you can really create those filters to make sure that the right information is exposed. Okay. You can also add different views. However, if you've got hundreds of subgrids against the form, they will load with the form and can impact form performance. So it's really good to only make sure the right subgrids are shown. When you look at related entities, you can see that they're available directly from the navigation perspective. So you can also add views. However, if you expose loads and loads and loads of related entities, or if you have lots of related entities, they can once again impact form performance. So it's a very good idea to keep your design in mind from a form perspective. So let's go and take a look at some of these components directly against their model-driven application. So what I've got over here is my maker experience once again. So make.powerapps.com. And you can see that I've got a number of applications open, right? So what we're going to first of all do is we're going to go and take a look at the timeline view directly against the contact record. So I'm using some sample data here. And as you can see, there's been some interactions with this specific record. Over there, just to point this out, I've got various activity types. Okay, so I've got an email, I've got a task, I've got a phone call, and I've got an appointment. And those are represented by the little icons directly on the left. I can interact with those records directly by popping the record out from the navigation over here. I can quite easily assign this record to somebody else. So if I wasn't happy with this phone call, I could simply click assign and add this to another user. What I can also do is add this to a queue, so I can actually queue this item up for another user to pick up and obviously delete. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a brand new record here. So let's quickly pop in, and these are the list of things you can create. Now, out the box, you get appointment, email, phone call, and task. These are quite natural, as well as notes. Donation is a custom field or a custom activity that's been added in here. So if you've got something like pledge or whatever you'd like, you can actually add that in as a custom activity to show against the timeline. So let's go ahead and add a task. So what this will do is I'm going to say, we're going to make this call contact. Really, really simply pop that in there. And I might want to put in a bit more information regarding quotes. I can make the call as long as I need to, make the task duration as long as I need to. I can set regarding. So remember, I had this set regarding as Maria, and it actually explodes her record over there. But I can go ahead and select another record type from the system. So we're going to save it and close that. Now, when I go back to my timeline view, you'll actually see that I've got a missed activity, all right? But then anything else will show in the timeline list. What I can do is I can go and take a look at that missed activity. So there it is over there. If I really want to, I can even filter my activities. So I'm going to say, let's filter all our activities by type tasks. And there we go. Now, this is a very basic example. There are hundreds of other examples where this becomes really, really relevant. And especially when users need to interact with information and there are thousands of activities against a contact or a different record, the filtering becomes quite important. A couple of other things. So I did mention the concept of subgrid and related records. At the very top, you can see I've got a list of related records over here. So if I click reviews, okay, this shows up in the tab and it'll show me the review, the associated information relevant to my product. Now, I don't always want to have to go and click on related to get information. So if I go back to my general form over here, you can see that I've got this specific set of reviews in the form of a subgrid. Now that's great because if I need to create a new review, instead of having to click on another part of the system, I simply hit new review and this will actually take me to a brand new record that I can add information to. Fantastic. What it's also done is it's kept the context of the person creating the review. All I simply need to do is test We'll add some comments. We'll give it a rating of 5, save and close. Great, that's fired me back to the previous record. You can see there's seven reviews there. If I click the arrow, you can see I've got my test review. Also, if I go back to my related list, you can see I've got my reviews in there as well. It's a very basic review of subgrids and timelines, and you can see you can access them directly from the relevant forms as well. So for the next part of the components, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be moving into managing form types. Within Power Apps, we have 4 primary form types. We have main forms, quick view forms, quick create forms, and cards. Each one is used in a different scenario. What we'll do is we'll drill into each one and take a quick look at how they work and what they do. So let's take a look at the main forms. These are the core part of the form side of the solution. If you think about the main form as the 360-degree view of the record. So it's the place people will go when they need to view information relevant to that specific record. In this scenario, we're talking about an account. As you can see, you've got your core account details on the left. You've got your collaboration and interaction information in the middle in the form of your timeline. And then you've got your related information on the right-hand side. Now, this is your main form. And the main form consists of various subcomponents. So you might actually have quick view forms embedded in the main forms, which I'll talk about shortly. You might have subgrids. You might even have other elements of the system like the relationship assistant that are made relevant here. Now, I have a rule about the main forms. When I have a default form that comes with the Power Platform in Power Apps, and I say, I want to be able to use this form later, I never edit the default form. I always make copies of it just in case I need to go back to a vanilla version or a blank version of that form. So best practice here is never to edit the defaults, always make copies. Quick view forms are really awesome because they enable us to expose information from a related entity directly on the primary entity's form. So in this example, there's a relationship between accounts and primary contact. So each account can have one primary contact. Now, I don't want to have that primary contact's actual fields existing against the account record or the account form. I want to reference them. Okay. So all I do is I create my lookup to primary contact, and then I create a quick view form. And every time my primary contact is selected, I then can show associated information directly on that form, on the main form, which is really useful because now the information doesn't have to exist directly in accounts. I can just reference the contact information. So it kind of keeps that referential integrity between the records without having to move data between the different data entities. The quick view forms should be used sparingly. So what I've found is not throwing quick view forms all over the place. So it surfaces key information from the parent record onto the child records. So this example over here, it's not showing the entire record. You only need core information. Now, what I typically choose is to make sure when information needs to be directly actioned or referenced. You can also have different quick views for different related entities. So I can have more than one quick view form per entity. So for this example, with the contact record, I could have one quick view form that's relevant to the account entity and another quick view form that's relevant to the asset entity. Now that makes it quite useful because again, I'm not moving information between data entities. I'm simply exposing it through the quick view forms. One of my favorite ones is the quick create. It just makes life so much easier when generating records. What we typically know is that when you're creating records and systems, often what happens, especially with relational solutions, is that you move away from the core record and into a kind of another record or a blank screen. And often the referential integrity hasn't been created or kept between those records. So what happens is that when you do quick view forms directly against the core record, the relational information gets automatically mapped. So it retains the relationship to the entity of origin when launched from that entity. And we'll show that later. You can launch quick view forms independently, but then you will have no mapping. So as an example, if I have an account and I create a new contact from my account, it'll bring in any mapped information from that account record onto the contact, like business phone number is a really good example of that. And then finally, cards. Cards are an incredibly useful mechanism to view data when inside dashboards in the solution. So typically with cards, you're getting a very core piece of information. It's not quite part of just a simple view, but it also has this ability for you to generate other actions and activities directly off that card. So as an example, this list over here, I've got a list of active cases. I can actually drill into those active cases and interact with them and even expand the card. you can see over here on the right-hand side, that's me popping open the actual list of things I can do with this. Now, you can't normally do that from a straightforward view, but it's really easy to do that from the card view. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop into a demonstration of how this all fits together. So as you can see here, we're going to start off using things like the main forms. So I'm going to drill out into make.powerapps.com. What I've done is I've gone into entities and I've opened up my ideas entity and I've gone into forms. Now, as you can see, I've got a number of form types. I've got a card, I've got a quick view form, I've got a main form, and a quick create form. So each one of those is relevant right now. So I'm not going to pop those open yet. I'm going to drop into my application, and we're going to open our first form, which is the main form. So this is the main place where stuff happens, right? So you can see I've got my core information on the left-hand side. I don't have any team members just yet. And actually, I can add and remove fields directly from this record if I need to. Over here, what you've got is you've got a quick view form. So each and every single idea is associated to a challenge. Now, the challenge, I've just given the described information. You can see those fields are locked, right? So this is just described information about the challenge. Okay, so now I don't have the ability to edit this data. I can view this data, but I can't edit it. So now that's a main form with a quick view form of the challenge inside it, right? If I go to challenges and I select connected operations over here, you can actually see that this is the core challenge record. If I go to related, as we spoke about before, and I go to ideas, you'll see the list of ideas. Now, when I create a new idea, typically what would have previously happened without a quick create form is that I would have been taken out to another blank page. But when I hit new idea, you can see that it's actually brought up the core record over here. So I can go test. I'll select my category from my drop down. And I'm just going to put in some random numbers over here. There we go. Save and close. The moment I create that, it gets auto-associated to that record, which is really useful. But I can simply click the view record link at the bottom, and that'll take me to the primary record where once again, my quick view form is exposing the challenge that this was associated to. So it maintains referential integrity when you use the quick create form. I can also very quickly jump out of my record into a dashboard with non-associated information and create a brand new idea from here without any association. So this idea will not be associated to a challenge. So the referential integrity is not relevant in this scenario. Finally, if I flick out and go to my fundraiser view and I go to my different cards over here, these are my cards that have got a consolidation of information from my donation application. If you take a look at Glyn, these are all the donations that have been made. I can actually drop into that card and undertake certain activities against that record. And those are effectively the 4 form types. Very important, something that you need to know, is if I go back into my records and I click entities and I go ahead and select an entity that doesn't necessarily allow for quick create, what I need to do is when you go to your forms and you say add a new form, you can see it says quick create. This will be blanked out if you have not set allow quick create in your settings over here. Enable quick create forms. If you do not check that box in the entity itself, you will not have the ability to generate quick create forms here. One other thing that's really important, if you'd like to, you can simply edit forms. This is my main form. I can quite easily save as, give it a new name. So we'll call this information version 2. Save this record. And actually what I've done here is I've duplicated the form. Awesome. So at the top right, you can actually see information v2. You always want to publish things you create. And what I'll do is I'll jump back into my entities and you will see a copy of that form over there. So now I've kept the integrity of my primary form, but I now also have the ability to edit this version 2, which I can then start including in my applications. So it's very important that you understand to keep the core integrity of your default forms always copy them and then reuse those forms that you've copied. You're not losing functionality, you're just protecting the default functionality. So with that, I'd like to wrap up that part of the demo. I think it's important that you understand that forms are a great way to start viewing and interacting with data, but it's very important to understand when to use forms and why they're there. Remember, the main form is your primary form that you're interacting with. Remember, a quick view form is effectively a summarized view of a related record onto the child record. A quick create form is a really great way to generate relational information directly from your primary record, or you could create it from blank. And then finally, a card is a really excellent way to view information in a list, but still have that form type interaction with it. So next on, we'll be moving on to customizing field controls. So what do we mean when we talk about customizing field controls? Well, it's actually quite simple. I'll break it down for you using a scenario. Let's think about you're sitting in front of your customer and you're talking to them about a sales opportunity. Now, instead of punching in the actual estimated value using your numpad, what if you had a slider control that just allowed you to increase that value? And that's where a custom control could come in. So you're basically replacing that sort of manual interaction with the numpad to a more visual representation using the slider control. Now, custom controls, the idea is to expedite the entry of data using the mobile interface. Because we're working with touchscreen devices all the time, the concept is we need to provide immediate visual references to that data. So once again, instead of seeing lists of data, there's another way to interact with that data using custom controls. One of the other things that we talk about is being able to leverage custom controls built with the Power Apps control framework, and that'll be spoken about in another session. But it's a really great way to visually interact with data. So let's take a look at the control availability for the different field types. Now, think about the different field types you always use in model-driven apps. You've got number fields. You've got single line of text fields and multiple line of text fields. You've got option sets. So the whole idea is that you want to kind of mask that, you want to put that overlay of the custom control onto that attribute. And we'll show you how to do that shortly. Now, this lists all the different types. I'm not going to run through them all. But let me give you an example of a great one, right? You've got an option set, and you might have a couple of different options within that option set. Instead of hitting a drop-down list, you basically have a control that looks very similar to this one over here. So instead of randomly scrolling through those options, you just select the one in a more graphical representation. A good example is your two options, where instead of you having a checkbox or a drop-down, you have a physical toggle called a flip switch, which you can then leverage. Another example of a custom control is what we call an editable grid. Editable grids are fantastic because they allow you to interact with data in a more sort of Excel-like fashion within a view or a subgrid. So now, when you have a list of data, you can start interacting with that in a more simple manner. So more than one record at a time, which is really great. So we call it inline editing, and you need to enable this for the various grids. So a couple of things to consider when using subgrids. First of all, when you go through and edit data in the one line, right, and you skip to the next line, the data is auto-saved into the first record. If you refresh the grid prior to you saving that data from the first record, you will lose the values or it'll reset. You can only edit existing records. You're not creating new records through the subgrid. So if you tab at the last line, it will not tab any further. The grid will honor the user setting for the number of records to display. So if your user setting is at 50 records, it'll show 50 records. If you've set it to 250, it'll show 250. This one's very key. Composite fields, state, status, and party list fields from the related entities will show, but they are not editable. When you're editing the editable grid, it will not cause a subgrid. It will not cause a hosting form to save. So if you have a editable grid in your primary form, so say you have an account entity with a list of contacts and you're editing those contacts, it will not save the primary related record of accounts. And then duplicate detection is suppressed when you're leveraging editable grids. So if you have duplicate detection enabled for various record types, it is suppressed when you're editing within the grid itself. A couple of other things that are really key around these types of components is actually building and creating views. Good views are really essential for usability of the system. You'll start finding that you'll create some views as a system admin, but a lot of users will create personal views, right? And essentially the view will reflow based on the display size. So depending on how large your page is, the view will actually open up, but the reflow behavior can be controlled if need be. So what we'll do is we'll dive into a bit of a quick demo around how these controls work. Right, so let's pop open our demo system. And as you can see here, I'm back in make.powerapps.com, and I've got a number of tabs open. So let's start out with what we call the custom controls. So if you take a look at this record over here, I've got an idea record. On this idea record, I've got what we call sliders. And sliders allow me to set the value depending on how the controller is set over here. If you take a look, I've got a number of stars, and this is a option set of either black or white for the various laptop colors. So these are different types of custom controls. Now, that's great because they look really good on a mobile device as well as the web clients. But how do you add them? Well, it's actually not too tough. So as you can see, I'm in my Maker experience. I'm on the form editor for the idea. On the right-hand side, you can see I've got a list of fields. Now, the list of fields basically allows me to add a very flat field. So if I go ahead and I say fund projects, and I hit save and then publish, and then I go from there to my actual idea form, and we'll refresh the page. Great. And you can see I've got my fund project field on the form. This is essentially a Boolean option set of yes or no. Now that's great, but what does the custom control look like for this? How do I make this look a lot more interactive? So what we do is we simply go back into our form editor, remove that specific field, go to components, and you can actually see I've got various inputs over here, and it gives you a highlight of what they look like. There we go. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag my toggle input over there. I'm going to select the field that I'd like to associate this to, and I want this to be available on all my different clients, so both web, mobile, and tablet. And we'll hit OK there. We'll save and publish. Once that's complete, we'll go back to our form and refresh it. Wonderful. And you can see my toggle has been added. So instead of me having that very basic Boolean selection, I now have a toggle switch over here. And that's the real easiest way of adding in those custom controls. The next thing I wanted to talk to you about is editable grids. So if I move over to my challenges entity over here, you can see that my view is active challenges. I've got a list of information. If I go ahead and click on various elements of this list, I can start updating directly in line. There we go. So very easy to change details, right? Now, before I would have had to actually drill into the physical record, make the changes over here, save the record, and then click back into the view to make those edits. But I can start editing those directly in line. The great part is that you can actually start editing this information directly against the record itself. So if you had a subgrid that was editable, you could edit that information directly against the form itself. Makes life a lot easier when changing records. The next thing I want to talk about is views. Views are very important in this solution. I'd like to show you how views work, and the best way to explain it is actually live. So you can see I've got my active contacts. These are the contacts that belong to me, and there are 13 of them. Okay. So if I select a contact record, and I say I'm going to assign this contact over to, let's pick Alex. Great, so I've sent that contact over to Alex, and you can see my view has dropped by 1. If I go ahead and select active contacts, that's all of the contacts within the system. Now that's really great, right? Now you've got lots of other different types of views. You can even pin views as your favorite. So I can say that active contacts is my favorite view, and that's the one I'm going to use from here on out. Now that's great. You also have the ability to create what we call as personal views. Now, personal views are very useful because they are basically the views that belong to you. So I simply go to Advanced Find. What I'll do is I'll say I'm going to create a new view. I'd like to see all of the contacts that have data in their email address. So we'll select email, and we'll say contains data. Fantastic. And I can go ahead and get those results. And here's a list of all the contacts that have an email address. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and we're going to go and edit that view. We want to make sure we get the right columns in my personal view. So what we'll do is we'll say add columns, and we'll pick some of the information that we need. So we know we need the contact information. The next thing we need is the email address. We're going to go with when the record was created. So created on. Amazing. So this is my information that I'm going to have in my view. We can also adjust the size. So if I want to, I can select that. So change properties and actually make it a little smaller. Great, so that's what our view is going to look like. We'll hit OK. Simply say save as, and we'll say my amazing view. There we are. Excellent. So once that's done, we can simply close that up, pop open. You can see my views. This is my view that belongs to me. And these are the records in my personal view, which is really great, right? So instead of me having to worry about all the records in this view over here, I can use my own personal view that I created. No one else has access to this view but me. I can share this view if I'd like to, but nobody else has it. When I build out system views, it's a little bit of a different story. So what I'm going to do is we'll go back into our Maker experience. We're going to use ideas again. We'll go to views over here. Now, you can either create a brand new view or you can copy a view like you did a form. I'm going to go add a view and we'll call this amazing system, my amazing system view. And we'll create this from scratch. Now, this is a view that everyone will typically have access to. Okay, so you can see out the box, you get access to the primary column. This is the name column. So what I'd like to do first is drag the description into that column over there. You might want to make it a little bit bigger. No problem, you can do that really easily. We'll drag in the idea score, or you can simply hit add column and then select the column that you would like to add from the list over here. So we can say originating challenge, which really helps us. What we can also do, select more fields, so we can say risk score. And if you really want to, you can even edit the filters. So you can say, I'd like to make sure that all of the fields, all of the records that are shown in this view are filtered by A, B, and C. So we're going to say add row. We're going to filter all of these by category, and we're going to say all the category records contain data. Magical. You can see the views filter has actually dropped a little bit over there. So we'll go ahead and save that. Don't forget to publish your view. Wonderful. Right, and what we'll do is we'll go back into our model-driven app, click on ideas. Let's go have a look at my views there. There it is, my amazing system view. And fantastic, here's my list. So it's very easy to create views and reuse them within the system. So the first thing we spoke about is custom controls and the ability to expedite the capture of data. You want to make that form as usable as possible, and custom controls are a real great option. The next thing we spoke about are views. You typically have personal views and system views. Personal views are typically developed by the user within the model-driven app, whereas system views are created by the administrator and shared with the entire organization. These views can be leveraged within other areas of the system, like subgrids and even reporting if need be. So next, we're going to move on to the next section, which is creating a model-driven application. Composing model-driven applications works a little bit differently to the way you compose Canvas apps. So with model-driven applications, you're typically creating the components first, which we've already done a whole bunch of, and then you're adding them to the actual solution or application afterwards. So in this scenario, what we'll do is we'll run through actually generating one of those model-driven apps. Now, typically your app designer looks a little bit like this, where you've got your core entity structure, your sitemap, your dashboards, and your business process flows directly in the designer. On the right-hand side, you've got your components and properties, so you can add different entities and dashboards if you'd really like to. And then finally, we'll drill into the actual sitemap editor. And that's the real core of this, to understand what the sitemap looks like and what your navigation will look like. Now, a couple of things to know about the designer. The first thing is, you cannot publish your app when you have a validation error. But you can publish your app with warnings. So typically validation errors will actually be issues that you have with your specific application, and it will warn you. If you decide not to select specific component types, i.e. forms, views, etc., it is going to select all of them. So in your model-driven app, if it says all, you will have every single form you've created for that entity. It's always best to select the specific views and specific forms you want for your app. And that's essentially that task-based experience that we spoke about. Finally, adding new components to the solution doesn't add it to the app. So as an example, we had a workshop previously about working with solutions. If you generate an app within that solution, nothing automatically gets added to that application. You need to manually add it. So you need to make sure that those components you've added to your solution are then added to that app. Finally, the solution publishes all its pending modules and sitemap updates, right? So when you build out onto your sitemap and you build up onto those updates and you hit that publish button, it will publish all of those pending updates. Right, so let's talk a little bit about customizing the navigation, because this is really important from a user experience perspective. So within the sitemap, you're kind of given a core structure that you need to use, and that's broken down into areas, groups, and sub-areas. What's important here is categorization and where things fit and why. Now, let me give you an example. If you log into an app and you have loads of headings all over the place, it's really difficult to find what you need to do next. Now, what we want to do is we want to try and split that out and break that up. And we do that with areas. So areas are effectively what you can see on the left-hand side of the page. So in this scenario, if you look into the middle of the page, you can see all the information for the sales area. Now, each of those areas is then broken down into sub-areas. So you can actually see you've got My Work, and that's where your activities and your dashboards go. Things like your customers, where you're dealing with accounts and contacts, right? And in sales, you can see you've got leads, opportunities, and competitors in there. If you think about this from a different perspective, you might have facilities management. And facilities management might have a group area called facilities. And inside facilities, you might have a header called buildings. And then underneath your header, you might have your buildings entities like buildings, floors, rooms, etc., right? So you can break that down really easily. Now, you don't want to break the sitemap. You want to work with the sitemap. And a navigation is a result of the merged sitemap from all of the solutions, right? So when you have that sitemap, it kind of brings it up into the actual application itself if you've got multiple solutions. What's really great is you can actually even point sub-areas to various other entities, web resources, and URLs. So if you've got like an external URL and you don't want to use a custom entity or a standard entity within the system, you can actually do that, and it'll load that URL up within the navigation and the sitemap. What you can also do is you can trim items off the sitemap using security. Now, if say, for example, the user's got a security role of X and another user has a security role of Y, if they're not allowed to see a certain entity, they won't. So no matter what solution they're in and what sitemap they're in, they won't be able to see that entity. And that's all managed through the security roles spoken about in the previous exercises as well. So what isn't filtered by the actual application? So I will demo this, and you have seen it in previous demos, but you're not filtered by search. So I can go ahead and search other entities. But remember, I won't find data if I don't have the right security roles and permissions. So Advanced Find gives me the opportunity to also search all entities within the system. But again, I'm locked down by my user roles and permissions, which is very important. Workflows, internal workflows can fire. Now, the one thing I want to bring up here is workflows effectively deprecated. So we should be using Power Automate flows. Okay. But if you have got workflows that are firing against other sets of data, that will be made available to you. And Power Automate flows, because they live outside of the system, you will be able to view those and access them if, again, you do have the right access, and those will fire based on the type of data or interactions that you're having with that data. So what I figured we'd do is go into a quick demo on how to generate a model-driven app. Okay, so I'm in the Maker experience, and I'm going to want to create a new app. One of the things you will have learned earlier in earlier workshops is that you should be creating new model-driven apps from within the context of a solution. So you can see I've got a bunch of different solutions here. I can actually create these applications directly within the context of the solution. However, this is managed. I'm not going to create a new solution. I'm just simply going to run you through a demo of how to create the app. So we'll build it without the solution. First things first, I'll go New App and select Model Driven. We'll call this app Contact Management. Great. And let's make sure it's actually named properly. Fab. So it's actually brought up my design UI. Now, as you can see, there's missing configuration. If I hit publish, it gives me an error, and it says to me, we can't publish the app because it has validation errors. And it's actually flagged where the validation error is. So that's an example of me not being able to publish my application until I've fixed all of my validation errors. Now, I've got all of my dashboards in the system and all the business process flows. If I click on dashboards, you'll see all of them over there. That's not what we want. The first thing we want to do is make sure we get the right entities into the app. Now, as I mentioned before, you can create the app from within the context of the solution, but it doesn't include all the components automatically. So what you need to do is go into Sitemap, and you're going to be adding various things to this. So the first thing we're going to add is the area. The area, we're going to call this Contact Management. So now the group is effectively the container underneath the primary area that'll help us kind of split my sub areas out. We're going to call this Management. Great. And inside Management, this is effectively where you're going to be selecting your various entities. So right now, I'm going to want to select Dashboards. That's the first thing, because I know I'm going to want to get a great view of the data. We're going to go ahead and we're going to pick one of the dashboards we want to use. Now, these are ones that are pre-existing in the system. Okay. I can add my own ones. So I'm just going to select Innovation Challenge so that you can see what it looks like. The second thing we're going to do is drag a sub area over underneath that. And what we're going to add in there is another entity, and we're going to select contacts. Great. So now I've got my contacts and I've got my dashboards. The next thing we're going to add is we're going to add in another sub area. We're going to select entities, and we're also going to add in accounts. So now these are the actual physical organizations. And then finally, we're going to drag in a new group to another head over there. We're going to call this My Work. Great. And under My Work, we're going to drag in another sub area, and we're going to make that entity activities. Awesome. Fab. So those are the entities that I need and the dashboards that I need in my solution. Hopefully it's going to look really fantastic. Let's publish this. Great. And now you'll see it's actually added accounts, activity, and contacts into my list. The thing though is I want to just make sure that my dashboard is actually filtered. So I'll deselect all and just make sure Innovation Challenge is selected. Now, if you really want to, you can actually remove things from the system, but I know my Innovation Challenge dashboard uses challenges and ideas, so I want to keep those in there. The other thing that I mentioned that was quite important is that it does include all forms and all views. So if I want to limit that again, I can simply select forms and just make sure that the right forms are selected. So I'll make sure my account form, I want to make sure my quick view forms are available to me, as well as my create forms. I can do the same thing with activities, and I can also lock down to the different views that people are seeing. So all I'm going to do is say all of my active accounts, all accounts, and I'll deselect that one. You can actually see it tells you the number of forms and views. It is always best to limit this as much as possible. So once I save that and I click validate, it'll tell me if there are any issues. There's a couple of warnings found, so activity doesn't reference a form or a view. That's fine. I'm not too worried about that. So it's the same thing for ID and the rest of the entities. So it'll give us all of them. So it does warn you that you've got all of the components in there. I'm simply going to publish because I can publish with warnings. And once I've done that, I'll hit play. And this will take me to my brand spanking new model-driven application. So we remember we had our dashboard, our Innovation Challenge dashboard. We only selected one, so that's the only one available to us there. We've got our list of contacts. Now remember, I didn't filter the contact view, so it's going to give me everything. But with the accounts, I did filter which views I wanted. So it's only going to give me active accounts and all accounts. And that, folks, is how you generate a model-driven application. So if I go back and summarize very quickly, number one, if I break down this entire workshop, model-driven apps require the data model in the Common Data Service. So you do need to have that data model set up correctly in the Common Data Service to manage the output of a model-driven application. What you then do is you build all of your components, then consolidate it into the app. As you can see, building the app is not very difficult, but it can take some time to build out all the components for the app. So you do need to make sure you spend time doing that. And then finally, because the UI and UX is component focused, it's really simply just about snapping those Lego bricks together to make sure that you give your users the best experience. In this part of the presentation, we're going to be talking about the automation options available to you within the Power Platform. Typically, we would focus on business rules, which are a declarative rules engine that allow you to create these amazing rules without writing tons of code. They're written both on model-driven clients and on server. They're involving typically the same entity. So when you write the rule, it's typically around one specific entity itself, and they are solution aware. What we also talk about is Power Automate. Now, in this part of the workshop, we're not going to focus on it hugely because it will be explained in more detail in another Power Automate virtual airlift. However, it is a massively scalable automation and it runs in the background. That's when we're talking about Power Automate flows. There are tons of connectors in there that connect to other systems altogether. It is hugely flexible and it is solution aware as well. What we also haven't told you here is that business process flows also form as Power Automate as well. So there's visual representations on top of the model-driven apps. That's part of Power Automate. And then finally, the classic Common Data Service workflow. Now, again, there are some use cases where you do need to use this, such as real-time workflows. However, one thing that's key is that Power Automate Flow is kind of replacing or is the more revered engine from a workflow perspective. So let's take a look at business rules. Now, this is your typical business rule designer. Some really great stuff in here that you can use. So what you'll first find is that you have your rule components, and this sets out the journey of your actual rule. The second thing you have is your available components. So you can drag and drop these onto the rule journey. You have your map view, which shows you the full rule journey and what's actually going on from a rules processing perspective. You have your text view, which translates that rules journey into text. And then finally, your command bar, which allows you to interact with those specific components within the rules journey. Now, what's the difference between business rules and developer client-side scripting? So for the pro devs out there, we'll get into this a little bit. Typically, business rules are for more simple scenarios. What happened was there was an aggregation done based on the type of stuff people were doing with client-side scripting. And they realized, setting values, setting fields as required or not required, creating recommendations was a key thing that was happening with business rules that people were writing lots of script for. Now, you can still do that using scripting, but the business rule engine is a much better way to do it and much more easy to manage. So with developers, you can actually do a lot more complex stuff and you can fill those digital gaps, but you're typically needing to let the functional consultants write their business rules and you guys take on the real complex stuff. So that's where the client-side scripting becomes very important. Business rules run in 3 different types of scopes. So you've got against the single form, you've got against all forms, and you've got against the entity. So I always say, if you've got a specific rule for a specific form, the single form functionality is a really good way to go. And that typically runs against your client side only. Now, if you don't want to have to duplicate that rule across all of the forms, set the rule context or the rule scope for all forms, and that'll be fine because that'll also run on things like quick view forms. And that's really important, right? But they should only really be used when the actions are visible. Okay. With entity, this is a bit of a different story because they do run both client and server. Okay. But the visual actions have no effect server side. So you do need to remember that. That's very important. When we start thinking about triggering business rules, what do we do to trigger them? Well, there's a couple of things. First of all, when you load up a form, that's a great way to trigger a business rule. So think about when you want to set a default value or you want to show some fields or hide fields or, set fields as required. That's a really great way to do form side for business rule loading based on the form load. The second one is around the rules execution on the change of the field. So when something changes on a field, this can happen client and server. So when, say, for example, you change a value, if it's saved, that'll be server side. If it's client side, then it'll be on change. Rules do not trigger on change event for other rules or for the client side script. So if I make a change, it will not trigger a business rule if it is client side. So if business rule makes a change, it will not trigger a business rule client side. However, this will work for server side, right? So it can trigger a rule itself if it's a server side save. What about one rule versus multiple rules? And this is kind of normal, right? So how do we break down rules? Some people like to have one massive rule where they can dig in and just kind of, manage all the entire processes there. And that's fine because that will work. And it's one place, one rule to rule them all, essentially. But what can happen is that it can lose its chances of triggering due to dependency. So if that rule has got too many dependencies and not all those dependencies are catered for, that business rule may not trigger, okay, which kind of leaves you in a bit of a lurch. What we've also found is that individual rules give more flexibility with editable grids. Now, with editable grids, if you don't have all the fields in that view and you're kind of hoping your business rules will fire, typically singular business rules or individual rules will fire based on a single field or 1 or 2 fields, whereas your larger rules require a lot more fields. So don't expect that to always work with editable grids. What we've also found is that duplicating some actions and rules accommodates for the lack of triggering by other rules. Don't feel afraid about duplicating actions. That's not a problem. Remember, you're not writing tons of code. Let's also look at calculating values. One of the really great functional pieces around business rules is calculating values. So things like adding 20 days to a shipping date, which you would normally have to write script for. The thing that we found is that this is used for really simple type calculations. Typically, within the calculated fields functionality in the form, you can do some much more complex calculations. What you can also do is you can set the calculated value using simple actions, each adding to the prior action value. So you can actually have a string of actions that take place that add to that specific value before it, which can be quite useful. Let's also have a look at Power Automate and Flow. Now, typically, business rules will get you so far. What you might need to look at is thinking about, well, if my business rule can only get me so far, I might need to use Power Automate or Flow. And that's where, you're looking at interacting with other entities from a relational data perspective, looking at augmenting that business rule syntax that you've got. You might need to even think about using custom actions or code when you're building up flows or workflows. And that really augments the whole process that you've got here. An example of a classic workflow is this. So this is what the classic workflow designer looks like. Some of you may only be using Flow, and that's cool, but it's very linear, right? So it's quite easy to see what's going on. And that representation of the opportunity process on the left is now made visible on the right-hand side. So lots of if-thens. When you're looking at the different types of workflows we have, at the moment we have background, which is asynchronous, and real-time, which is synchronous. Background workflows, the results don't typically be needed right away. So you're looking at things like wait conditions, and you can have long-running workflows, right? But it's typically going to be run separately. With synchronous workflows, your response is going to be immediate, right? So it's going to happen immediately. The workflows need to be quite simple, so do not overstack a real-time workflow. Let's take a look at business process flows. So business process flows are the sort of more visual mechanism to look at the way an entity process or a data journey is being run. Now, what you're looking at here is trying to encourage outcomes from the user interacting with that specific piece of data. You can also link to different entities if you'd like to, and they don't necessarily have to be related. It really changes and amplifies the way that a user approaches the system. So instead of having tons of fields on a form, you can actually have this guided process flow, which we'll show you. And you can also trigger background automations if you need to. As an example, this is what we're looking at. So you can see the form at the very bottom over there and the middle there, and you can actually see the guided process flow at the top. So what we're doing is we're giving people a roadmap or a recipe to capturing data, and this is guided through stages and steps. Now, each stage will have a series of steps that people either need to fill in or don't need to fill in. And if they don't, they can potentially be locked in that stage for a certain period of time. There is the opportunity to do branching logic, so you can split that process flow out into another journey. You can include lots of different entities, and you can switch these process flows at any time to a new process flow if you would like to. And they are role tailored. So if you've got a certain role, a certain set of permissions, you'll be able to see and interact with those business process flows. And yes, there are developer APIs available for this. From a designer perspective, it's very drag and drop. So you're simply moving these kind of components around and snapping them together to create your process flow. So let's go and have a little look at what this looks like, right? Once again, I'm starting off my demo in the Maker experience, and I'm going to click out into my ideas application. You can see I've got a list of ideas over here. If I click over to Tiny Homes idea, let's have a look what's in here. You can see that I've got an idea of tiny homes, and my idea score is 6. Now, there's a recommendation that's made there. Take a look at this. If your idea score is less than 8, you need an idea score of greater than 8 to receive funding. So I'm going to change that to 8. And you can see my project funding has received yes. My idea score recommendation has disappeared. If I change that back, that happens once again. And that's a business rule running in the background on the form side. Okay, so how did I do this? Right, so I've basically got my business rule that's been created here. And the first thing I do is I go ahead and I check the idea score. And if the value is greater than 8, I go through that path over there, the correct path with the checkbox. If it is not, I make sure the fund value is set to no. And then I also make a recommendation on the idea, and I give that idea an action. Now, that's very, very simple. If you'd like to drag and drop new components on there, you can quite easily do that by simply just adding another component, making a suggestion, and then finally saving it. So I'm going to lock the idea score if it's yes. Very easy, save, and it will tell you if there are errors, and activate. Very, very easy to add business rules. Now, once you've done it, they'll be immediately available directly on the form. So if I simply go refresh, and I drag and drop my idea score to above 8, it's actually locked that field, so I can't edit it anymore, and that's happened form side. In this next part of the process, I'd like to take a brief look at business process flows. Now, as you can see at the top of this record, I've got create, develop, and score. And I've been asked to add in 3 other steps underneath this. If I change the score from funding of project to yes to no, you'll see that those steps disappear. So let's quickly add that back to yes. Now, how is that designed? Well, if I go to my business process flow, you'll notice that this is my idea to project business process. I've got create, develop, and score. At the very end of that, I have a conditional branch that actually says, if the score is yes, then continue through the process to creating another entity. If it is no, then simply stop the process there. Now, these are actually quite simple to create. You're dragging stages onto the form, and as you do that, you're able to rename them and add conditions, data steps, workflows, and other things. And this will really help you build out your business process logic relevant to this specific application. So in summary, it's always good to know when to use the different automation options: business rules, Power Automate flows, and workflow, as well as business process flows. Now, typically that's going to be down to the business problem that you're solving. The next thing is that business process flows are the graphical representation of the process within the model-driven app. The automation that runs behind it will be your business rules, Power Automate flows, and workflow. But the business process flows are the red bar you see above the top of the entities. And we hope to see you again soon for another one.
Thank you, Chris, for the great insights. Now I'd like to invite Nelson to discuss detailed automation options.
Okay, so once we have our user experience and basic data model, we need to think about automation and what automation options there are. When it comes to model-driven apps, we actually have quite a few options for automation and business logic. Business rules, CDS, classic workflow, business process flows, and Power Automate. Where you would use each of these technologies really depends on what you need to do. Business rules, you can think of business rules as tiny chunks of automation. They're composed mainly of declarative, simple rules. They run in both the client and the server side, and they are solution aware, which means you can package them up. CDS Classic Workflow, for those of you that have a Dynamics CRM background, this is the same workflow engine. It's still very capable. It runs in the background or in real time, and it's also solution aware. Business process flows. This has to be one of my personal favorite features of model-driven apps, not only because of the automation capability, but it really does enhance the user experience by guiding them through the application while providing accountability and efficiency. Business process flows are also a feature which is now part of Power Automate, and they can be used with or without a model-driven app. And then we have Power Automate. And there's a lot of capability in Power Automate, so much so that it warrants a separate course. And as such, it's out of scope for this training. But look out for a separate Power Automate course in the near future. But just a couple of points on Power Automate. It is the most flexible, feature-rich automation option for model-driven apps. Unlike CDS Classic Workflow, it right now, at least at the time of the recording of this training, it only runs in the background. So in other words, it doesn't have a real-time execution option like CDS Classic Workflow, at least not yet. And of course, the greatest capability of Power Automate is the ability to go beyond the data in CDS and bring in data from a number of different applications, Microsoft third-party applications, using the 300 plus connectors that are out there. So let's go ahead and take a closer look at the first three. A little bit on business rules. So business rules can be used to apply some small form of automation, business logic, and validations. They're created using a very intuitive drag-and-drop graphical interface that looks really similar to what you saw in the app designer, and it'll look very similar to the designer for business process flows. Business rules are based on an if and then condition and actions. And what you're looking at the table here are some of the actions that are possible. So you can set field values, you can clear field values, you can set field requirement, you can show and hide fields, you can disable and enable fields, you can validate data and show error messages, and so forth. Now, I know that this module is around model-driven apps, but business rules are also effective in Canvas apps. But when it comes to showing and hiding fields or enabling fields, business rules can't make that happen, but there are other ways to show and hide fields, enable, disable fields in the Canvas app through custom code. Okay, let's go ahead and take a look at business rules. So we need to go ahead and sign in to Power Apps, specifically make.powerapps.com. And we need to go over to the data section and select entities. And we need to select the entity that we're going to create the business rule for. So in this case, it is device order. And then look for the Business Rules tab. And you can see here that I have a number of business rules created for this specific entity. I'm going to go ahead and select Add New Business Rule to create a new one. And here is the designer interface for the business rules. So over here in this section here, this is actually where we compose our business rules. And then over to the right-hand side, we have some components, and which consists of a condition. And then we have a number of actions. So the same actions that we saw just a moment ago, the ability to set field value, set the visibility of the field, set it business required, and so forth. And so we can see here we already have a condition. If we go ahead and select that condition, we can set the properties for it. So let's go ahead and give it a display name. And what I want to do here is I want to check to see whether the device order field is blank, or if it has just an X in it. And as such, if that happens, then I want to go off and generate a device order ID using some other automation. So the entity is already set for device order. So is the source. In terms of the field, we need to set it to device order ID. And in terms of the operator, we have quite a few options here. Equals, does not equal, contains, does not contain. What we want to do is see if there's any value at all. So we want to check to see does not contain data. Now, we can add additional rules to make this more complex. So I'm going to go ahead and add another one. The source entity, let's go ahead and select device order ID. And in this case, we want to use the operator of equals, and we want to check for specific values. So we want to check for the value of X. And here we have the rule logic. So this is the operator. We can do an AND or an OR. In this case, we'll do an OR. And once we're done, we'll go ahead and hit apply. Now, we can go ahead and drag and drop an action now. So the action that we want to set is field value. And we want to drag it over here where the plus sign is. So that signifies that if this condition resolves to yes or true, then we want to perform this action. So I'll go ahead and just drop it in there. And again, here we also have the ability of setting the properties. So I'll give this a name. I want to go ahead and select the device order ID field. The type here, we have a few different options: value, field, clear. Going to go ahead and select field, and then we can set it to a number of different fields that are available to us. In this case, it's auto number. Hit apply. Now, you can imagine that this is a very simple condition and action, very simple rule, but you can imagine that this can get quite complex. So we do have the ability of zooming in, zooming out. As we do that, we have a little mini map at the bottom left-hand corner. You might have also noticed that as we're composing this business rule, this code is being generated. This is really just for read-only. Some people prefer to view it this way. There's also a feature here to take a snapshot that you can use for documentation or to share with a colleague. So once you're done with the rule, you need to go ahead and save it to validate it, and then publish it. And one last thing that you need to do is to set the scope. We're going to talk about that in just a moment. So as you create business rules, you can set the scope on a single form, all forms, or at the entity level. When creating a business rule, you need to set the scope, which determines where and when the business rule will be applied. there are three options. You can run the business rule on a specific form, you can run it on all the forms, or you can run it at the entity level. In the case of a single form, which is the default, and also in the case of all forms, the business rule will only run at the client, on the client side. In the case of the entity, it can run on both the client and the server side. So when should it be used in the case of all forms? It's when the actions that you need to apply are only visual. So for example, the actions that you can apply are things like showing error messages, showing and hiding fields. When should it be used at the entity level? When you want that business rule to run, regardless of whether the user is initiating it or it's being initiated programmatically, for example, using plugins or integration jobs or workflows. Some other considerations around the limitation of a single form. If you want the business rule to run on an editable grid or view, you'll need to use another option like all forms because it won't run on a single form. So given that any entity could have potentially a number of different forms, right? There's the main form, the information form, quick rake form, the Outlook form. In fact, you could have a different form for every security role. What happens if you have a number of forms, but you only, let's say you have 5, but you only want the security rule to run on 3 of them? Well, in that case, you actually have to write a specific business rule that is targeted to each of those 3 forms. So that's a little bit about where the business